Welcome to the 3CL podcast. My name is Ian Farrugia, and on this episode, we bring guest Katarina from Sweden.
Okay, Katarina, so we meet again
Yeah.
after a long time.
Yes, finally.
Finally. I mean, last time we met was in Gothenburg, and you had, your kids
Yeah.
jumping up
Yeah.
and down.
I came there only to meet you, so
Yes.
I had to bring them. Yeah.
That's right,
Yeah.
the Research Institute of Sweden. And I have one person who I taught, who's Ian, and there's Alex, who I never taught, but somehow we kind of appropriated or kidnapped when he turned up and made a lot of noise and asked questions at a conference of mine. And I remember that the first time, maybe it was the first time or the second time you and I had a conversation, you started with, "Who are you?"
Yeah.
Which, got me into an existential crisis for about 10 seconds, and then I rattled off the usual things. I'm an old man living in a tiny country and with loads of problems. So who are you, Katarina?
This is karma. It's coming back to me.
yes.
Yeah, it was, of course, very intentional of me to ask that. And I work at the Research Institutes of Sweden, but that is only a small part of my identity. And from that platform of mine, I started like 3 years ago publishing this podcast, which actually says more about me because it's about lifelong learning. And I discovered that I probably have a DNA or a gene or something that takes me to this constant exploration kind of mode. Always wanting to learn new things, having been learning for a much longer time than my title, which is now Research in Lifelong Learning, much more longer than I had that title. But from that podcast, I started unintentionally from the beginning to ask every guest, "Who are you?" And I did see that existential crisis every time happening, or the perplexity of it. So why are you asking me who I am? I'm so used to you asking me what I do and what results I get. And I think that is symptomatic of how our view on life.
Yeah.
So who am I? I am a Swedish citizen with 75% Polish blood running through my veins. I was born in Stockholm, but I don't live there anymore. I live in a smaller city of Sweden. I don't work in the city where I live, so I commute a lot and I travel a lot. And I'm constantly exploring what I do, but I'm also a very devoted family person. So I have 3 sisters, 1 in Warsaw and 2 in Stockholm, and 3 daughters. It's a lot of ladies in my life. And together with them, I learn a lot. But then I explore in my professional time. Learning for all of us, and especially grown-ups.
I think it's fair enough that we ask the other 2 guys who they are.
Yeah,
Now, on the basis
isn't
that they're both classified as Gen Z, whatever that means.
Yeah, let's come back to that.
So Alex, who are you then? Don't spend 10 hours telling me, okay?
I'm Alex. I come from a very mixed background. I speak 3 languages, but I think in only one of them. I think in Russian. But my mum's from the former Soviet Union, so she's a whole concoction of nationalities. My dad's half English, half Maltese. I grew up in a diplomatic family, so I have no roots. I've spent maybe maximum 3 years at a time living in a place, from the People's Republic of China to London to Moscow. And I settled in Malta about 13 years ago, so that's where I've lived. I'm no longer a student, I'm self-employed. I do a whole plethora of different things, and my preferred professional title is total generalist. So I like collecting skills, it's my thing.
I love that.
Yeah, we'll talk about generalist skills. So Ian, what do you do? Who are you?
I work in PR, giving a platform to fine arts, so I work in 2 different TV programs dedicated to the local cultural scene. And I also produce content for the 3CL Foundation.
Yeah, I want to try and take this from the point of departure of the 2 things, because in a way, let's contextualize this. Katarina has just been co-teaching a class which I run at the university, and it's a first-year internet communications class. It really should be called New Media in the Social World. I think that's the new title. You have basically students there who are aged from 19 till mid-20s, I guess. And for me, it's always interesting bringing somebody from the outside into the academy as such. From my perspective, it's interesting to see how students react. But it's also for me a crash course into understanding how they learn, and what they don't learn. And the context this morning was about podcasting, which is your area of expertise in a way. And so I'd be interested in knowing how you got into podcasting, because I know you had a background in radio.
Yeah.
And why podcasting is important for learning, let alone lifelong learning. And we'll riff into that later.
Yeah. So that is kind of a longer story than I think you would imagine, because when I was young, when I was maybe younger than you two, a bit younger, I was convinced that I was going to do music. But then I studied English and Swedish on the side, and I had a teacher like you telling me, oh, you're such a journalist all the time. So that became my path. I applied to the University of Media and Communication and took my bachelor degree there. And then at the university, in this kind, like the studio we're sitting in now, fell in love with the radio as a medium. I was dazzled by the nerve, the live situations, and I think that is where I discovered the power of questions, which I talk to your students about today, to being able to. And I think before that, I even was kind of thinking about maybe psychologist would be a way. So I was finding a way to dig into people or reach into people, first with the thought of music, then maybe a therapist or psychologist, and then through media. And then after 20 years in media, I really was tired of it. I did think that it was as I told your students, everybody was saying, I'm a journalist because I'm so curious, but there were no curiosity, no learning. It was finding the answers, showing off, doing shows for other journalists, and kind of a narrow bit of the reality. So then I left. I was self-employed as a consultant. I did consultancy in media and the digital transformation kind of thing, and how that disrupts our lives and so on.
See how much you like it by you changing.
Yeah, exactly. You can see it was lots of buzzwords and lingos and that kind of stuff. And then at one point I got a call from the Research Institutes of Sweden, and they said, do you want to build up a professional education department here? Because we can see that what you are doing is learning. So I did that. And then after a couple of years, my background catched up with me, and they said, oh, you have been doing so much media, so much radio, so much interviewing. Shouldn't we do something out of that? So I started to create learning journeys or online courses or knowledge bases online using my media skills. In a new way, in an actual curious way. And from that, somebody said, you really should have a podcast. And as I said, it was a transition, because a podcast for me is slightly different from the radio shows that I used to make.
I think I'm interested in podcasting for two reasons. One is I've set my students tasks to come up with a podcast, and I realized this morning that most of them aren't taking it as seriously as I think they should be. I mean, you mentioned today several times that they need to research what they're going to do. It's not just something that you wake up, go and meet your friends. And, I've actually had students in the past munching, food and then talking to each other and saying it's a podcast, for instance. Okay. But I think the other thing which I think is really interesting, and I want to ask these guys about it in a way, is about learning and lifelong learning. The way lifelong learning is situated in this country, lifelong learning is associated with adult education here. It's associated with something you do after you leave education, compulsory or higher education. And I'm kind of interested in how people are learning these days, and whether people are learning from podcasts. And I think it's a question you asked. Okay, so I'm asking these guys here. I mean, do you learn from podcasts? Are there podcasts you listen to? Which kind of podcasts do you listen to?
You got me into Gary Lineker's entire universe of podcasts. So he has everything from The Rest is History to Battleground Ukraine. My favorite, The Rest is Politics and Leading. That was by far, when you told me about that, I was like, yeah, I'll just kind of put it on the back burner. And then I came across it. I'm like, wow, this is really, really great primary source material. In the case of The Rest is Politics, it's two guys who've actually been at the heart of politics talking and commentating about it. And in today's media space, you really do get a lot of people who not necessarily, not qualified isn't the word, it's just they have no first-hand experience about it, but their commentary is still interesting and they get a lot of traction because of it. But when you run into these kind of insights, because it's a medium, like you're saying, that's transition from the old media space to the new media space quite seamlessly. So it's not something that requires a massive kind of readaptation of your skill set. If you're good at talking, you'll be good at making podcasts as long as you have maybe a little bit of back end help. And just kind of every week I discover something new. But Gary Lineker's universe of podcasts is by far the best. Like,
Okay, what are you doing?
Wow.
Do you listen to anything?
So I feel like it's something very generational where I listen to podcasts every day, but I think this is something that your students didn't bring up. I put them on for company. So I work from home, and I have maybe a bunch of these podcasts where I can have in the background kind of white noisy, but then when I like tune out of what I'm doing, I'm like in a blank state, I end up learning something sort of involuntarily because I'll catch something and like, okay, now I know something about hormones or American like regional English. So yeah, my favorite podcast is a linguistic one called Away with Words. And it's a call-in show where anyone from across the United States calls in to like ask about something that either they know their family says regularly that they feel is unique or something.
But it's something that you mentioned, how, because in a way with your background, and you were in radio, and then got into podcasting quite naturally. Okay, in my case, I've never had any training even for teaching, but my best learning for teaching was I did theatre in my younger days. So I learned how to perform. I always equate teaching to stand-up comedy. There's no other way around it. Whatever anybody says, the best teachers are the ones who can tell stories.
Yeah.
And I know that there was a time when I used to riff off a script, and now it's my script. And that's how I transitioned from whatever it is I used to do. But I'm interested in the fact that both you and I are interested in podcasting and lifelong learning. And I'd like to know what you think lifelong learning is.
Yeah.
Before we ask these guys, or I can tell you what I think lifelong learning is, but
Yeah,
over to you.
I can say. I just have to say that the beauty of podcasting for me is that it is all this, and even those who doesn't make the research, as you said, there are super many, and for me quite uninteresting, like conversational podcasts, just two people sitting down and talking. They have been doing none of the research thing. But that is maybe company for one person. I have a memory when I was very young and working at a regional Swedish radio station, and the power went out in the city. And this lady called me and she said, "My power is out." And I said, "Why are you calling me? I'm working at the radio. Why are you calling me? Go call your power station or whatever." And like 20 years later, I realized I was her company. I was her like center of her day. She listened to me every day. So of course she called me. And that is kind of the beauty of the podcast, and also why I think it's one part of this ecosystem of lifelong learning that I think we have to move towards, which means that we have to find new networks, new structures, new culture, new organizations, new people to understand how we learn lifelong. In Sweden, we also talk about lifelong learning like everything but school or the formal educational system. And one of my ambitions with my work today as an applied researcher in this area, in this field, is to connect that together. Because where does the learning start? It starts when we start breathing. But if it's not in place in school, and it's not, because we measure how much students and pupils want to learn more. There is like one question that the Swedish authorities are asking pupils: do you want to learn more? Is school like motivating you to being able to find more about this? And those numbers are decreasing every year, and it's decreasing more the older you get. So the school system kind of kills your motivation. So we have to bridge that gap, because then they come into the labor market, into work, and somebody sends them on a course to me, and the aim is to get more innovative, and you have to solve the big challenges in the world, the climate change and all of that, and you have to learn constantly, but you were never trained to, never. So for me, lifelong learning is, it's about becoming a human being with everything, informal, non-formal, formal, just relations. I mentioned my family, studying, but also like having conversation, having spaces for conversation when you work, so you can exchange like experiences and insights. So yeah, it's all of that to me.
I mean, my obsession with learning kind of crystallized in a way, it's the other hat that I have, which is how I've engaged with some of these younger people and colleagues around me, is that I had two opportunities which I seized on. One was a minister way back in 2013 who called me, and he knew I was going to escape this country because I had got my PhD then and I was going to leave. And he said, we're supposed to have a lifelong learning strategy for Malta. And I said, yeah, that's interesting. He said, no, can you come and help because we're in trouble? And I said, I'm about to leave. The long and short of it is I wrote a lifelong learning strategy for this country almost on my own when I realized that many of people were disengaged from the whole concept of lifelong learning. I had people from university saying, that's our domain. You're not an expert in this. Yeah. How dare you come in and talk about lifelong learning? We are the experts. One. Then there were people within the organization who said, who is this guy coming in? And I literally waited for months, waited for people to come and engage, because my task as a strategist was to get this thing together. In the end, I wrote it. Was it implemented? Not really.
No.
Because that was the external guy coming in to do it. So then I had the second opportunity, which was again, I've just come back from Vancouver, ironically, and I was in a conversation with the president of the Commonwealth of Learning over there, and she had this idea about funding, putting in a bursary somewhere related to something called connected learning. And I realized that my obsession with lifelong learning, in other words, if you don't learn, you don't have a life anymore, could also be channeled into this thing called connected learning. In other words, I know something, you know something. Now we can learn together through a podcast. I still hope, being a professor within a university, that, as I said, there we were this morning, right, with 60 students. How many people were getting what we were talking about? You were constantly asking them to ask questions. How many people replied? 5, 4, 2. So from my perspective, as an much older person, and the Gen Zs over here, I'm whatever the Gen Zs mean, because again, these guys are saying, don't put me in a bucket. I mean, I have a 21-year-old son who says, what does this mean? But I think this obsession that some of us have about learning, knowing that the institution is not going to go away, universities are not going to go away. We were having this conversation before that even in Sweden, people still want to go to university and get the degree. That's the credential. I did a lot of work for UNESCO and MasterCard in Africa, for instance, where you have people even, they're being told you should get a job, a TVET job. You should become a plumber or an electrician. And the parents still want to starve themselves to get them to university because that's the golden seal of learning.
Yeah, that was the golden ticket into a life that they didn't have.
Has that changed in Sweden? Do you guys, do you still look at it that way with the labor market?
I know we have had a kind of a exponential development within the vocational education system, which is more modular, more every education that starts within that system has to show that we can actually match according to the needs on the labor market, and every year they have to do that. So if they can't, that education goes away. So that is more putting more money, resources, and efforts into developing that, because of we had this governmental program for skill supplies and lifelong learning that I was one part of. There were different groups from different sectors. We put people together. Now talk about how we should solve this lifelong learning. It was kind of building a strategy, but with no strategy. Yeah, and also we should cooperate on this, and everybody was just pushing their agenda for it. So the labor market this, the industry this, the universities this, and so on. But I would say that the discussion is very, for me, even too focused on the labor market at times. It's like the skill supply discussion is not for us to become citizens and informed people trying to cope in this agile world, but it is for the needs of the labor market. For me, that's a bit narrow. But I think that also the good thing about that is that it has disrupted the discussion that it's only the long engineering, Sweden is an engineering country. Those long programs are not the only way anymore.
Okay, I'm going to ask these guys about lifelong learning, right? Because it's associated with older people. And yet one of the strange things about Malta, maybe not in Sweden, is I asked my students today, first year, right? How many of you are working? 15% admitted. That means about 25% are working, maybe even 30%. Okay. So this whole idea about what do you learn from, I think. And I mean, you're a good example of somebody who was at university, no? And decided it wasn't for you.
Yeah.
And it's quite fine for you to tell people why you didn't think it was for you, and what do you think? And what do you learn from? Because clearly you connected and you're learning from somewhere. How do you learn?
So the way I learned to learn, so the methodology behind learning was I got chucked into the cadet forces when I was young because I was a bit of a delinquent. And in the mainland UK, where the organisation is basically like a military youth organisation, and over there in mainland UK, you know, they have a lot of health and safety practices. It's very toned down, whereas in Malta, as we all know, where a lot of old British military veterans come to retire, it becomes a bit of an empire building project. So you have this weird concoction of very young kids and, you know, hardened global war and terror military veterans. And weirdly enough, that was where I learned how to teach and how to absorb information, because they teach you two things. Number one, how the Dunning-Kruger effect really works.
Yeah.
And number two, the difference between an adaptive and a rigid mindset. If you have a rigid mindset, you take what you learn and you instill it into your personality, so it becomes
It's
a part of you.
Growth
Exactly. You make it. It's like those people who really push their kind of agenda onto you. They tell you what they know, who they are, what they believe in. Whereas if you're constantly adaptive, so you understand the Dunning-Kruger effect is real, and you live in constant fear of it, but as a result, you're constantly taking in new information. You're never comfortable with where you're at. And as a result, my goal is to get out of my comfort zone as much as possible. So after I left university, my goal was pick up as many manual labor skills. Since then, I've learned how to weld, how to fix a car, how to fix a motorbike, and it's all just because, like, I wake up in the morning and I say, I should really go to the mechanic, and then I'm just like, no, I'll go on YouTube. I start digging and I spend hours doing it, and with any skill. The same thing as, like, if I run into someone at the pub and I feel a bit intellectually intimidated by them, I ask them. I'm not afraid to admit, like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Sure.
What do you read? Like, what's the literature behind this? And I go back, I read it, and I come back to the pub the next week. I'm like,
That's how we learned about aquabionics.
exactly, yeah. Aquabionics, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. Your biggest teacher is a guy in a small village whose garage is filled with chickens.
My mate Neil, this guy is a real life MacGyver dude. Has no paper qualifications except for aircraft maintenance. But since when I met him, he was like 14. He was stripping down his granddad's Toyota Starlet, and, like, with full confidence, I was watching this as another 14-year-old with no technical knowledge. I'm like, how are you doing this? You're not qualified. And he's just like, you watch and learn.
But these disconnects are important. And
Yeah.
it's also, I'm going to dovetail back into some of the stuff that you've been doing, okay? Because at the 3CL, okay, the 3CL Foundation, which I kind of run together with being here, and I find it very useful in a way. It's like I come to university, I feel like I'm using one part of my brain.
Yeah.
And then when I'm working with the 3CL, we're looking at more activist projects. And we're also looking at filming everything. So even now, doing this podcast, when I asked, it's evidence of what you do. When I'm saying I went to Vancouver, my first meeting with the president of the new president of the 3CL of the call was like, okay, we're having a polite conversation. Between day one and day two, the guy had gone in and looked at some of our conference and seen what we were doing, realized that there were people that he knew that were also sitting next to me, and that was all the credentialing stuff. And suddenly it's like you engage. But this whole thing about where is learning coming from, and what happens with people who may, like Alex, have decided for the time being university is not for him. And I did try and persuade him. I said, come and do something else with my faculty. And he's going to do something else instead. Or Ian, who has been through the system and got his credential and his funny hat and he's graduated and now saying that he's trying to figure out what to do with life. I'm wondering about stuff that you've done. And specifically, I'm thinking about the Trainstation project that you did with kids over there. Just talk about that. Because I'm kind of interested in seeing how we can apply some of that stuff, even in this small country. Remember with Malta has ideas above its station, right? We're the tiniest, most irrelevant country on the planet, okay? In Turkish, apparently, the word Malta, I found out, means nothing. Because after the Great Siege, when the Turks lost and the Turks went back and they said, where were you? They said, we were in Malta, nothing.
Nothing.
It's nothing. So from a place from nothing, which has this great gift of creating something out of nothing.
Yeah.
Over to you about marginalized.
Yeah. Can I just ask again, what made you stay? What made you? I mean, if you didn't go for a degree and a credential, what made you?
I graduated 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, I love being in university.
Yeah. What do you love about it?
I loved doing my dissertation. I loved researching. So yeah, I love the practical side of what my course offered. I didn't go into masters because I realized that I had nothing to bring to it outside of academia, you know, which is quite useless for myself, which I actually want like practical, career-driven know-how.
Yeah. So you're not. No, but I was asking because this is the case. I mean, when I'm here at the university where we sit now, and in any university, in any place in the world, I've been to Hong Kong, to China, to different kinds of universities in Europe, in the US. I just love being in that environment. And I think it's about that I kind of I sense this learning thing. And my sister actually took a DNA test to see our genes. So I know that I come from this small part of population that creates Nobel Prize winners and so on. That is that's why I'm saying it's running in my veins. But I'm not interested in an academic career at all. I haven't done a PhD. I think I will never do one. And I'm not interested in the prestigious kind of structural things.
And being called professor.
No, not at all.
Yeah, they haven't put my name outside.
Yeah, exactly. But the school trains that is like the highest level you can come to. And I love what you were saying, Alex, about how you got the feeling of lifelong learning. Actually, I have colleagues that have been their training is military. And when you say, the other Alex say that the students are working, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. No. Because what the military does, it's kind of that you constantly go in and out of contexts to bring your theoretical knowledge into the practical one, and then back, and then again and again. So that is something that I wish I was more trained from the university. We had like internships. I did one at Swedish Radio and then ended up there. But if I had more like interaction with the needs and what I was doing, I think that would have benefits for me. So back to your question. I've been in this huge research project from this governmental program that I mentioned, it was called Learning How to Learn. It's conducted by a university, but it's an interdisciplinary group. So it's the labor market, universities, us at RISE, and so on. And the research part that actually is from the psychologist field is about what mechanisms drive learning. Why do you want to learn and when? And one kind of depressing finding is that people like you, Alex, you're born with that. The ability and the need and the want to constantly look around the corner, to bring on new things, that is something, it's in your personality. And then you can end up with a dad like me who came from Poland and had this motto that nothing is strange. It might be different, but nothing is strange. We hated that as kids because we said that is strange and that is strange. But his way of having the family culture that way, that you can bring anything on. You just fake it till you make it, or you just do. He was very like go to the university, but that formed me very much. So I had the personality, and I got help from that kind of being raised that way. People who doesn't get this kind of, maybe you have not got this personality thing, you never get to train it, you never live in this culture where this is promoted. You just you have to study for your grades or whatever, or you don't study at all. You go into the manufacturing industry and you never studied after your mandatory elementary school. If we don't design this learning for them as well, we lose like very many people and very much of a potential. So that have been interesting me, because the driving forces that they found out of this was curiosity, that if you learn out of inner driving forces and not like for badges, grades, certificates, or punishments, then you get this way of lifelong learning. You get that from inner driving forces. If you recall old knowledge that you already have, not only in tests, but if you teach others, for example, then you want to learn more, and you actually make room in your brain for more knowledge by teaching others. That is probably why you're still here, Alex, in this.
Well, you maybe remember two things. One, I'm not a product of a university education, unlike these guys. Okay, because I'm old. Okay, at the age of 18, there was no university to come to. All the courses that I wanted to follow over here had been destroyed, deemed to be dangerous. So I found myself at the age of 18 doing the one thing I never wanted to do. I had no idea, I became an accountant. I was working by day, studying by night. Nowadays, I'm still conflicted about whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. I think in the long days, I think it was a good thing because it made me do really difficult stuff, do the kind of things that Alex is talking about. I had no head for numbers, and yet I was forced to look at this because I was a literature kind of guy. Yet, when it came to much later in my life, so when you talk about a PhD, I did a PhD when I was in my late 40s. Certainly had no intention to come to university and teach at the time. I did it for me. But I felt I wanted to find the other part of me, which had been lost, even though I made a very successful career abroad and done stuff over here. Because I realized that I was addicted to learning, and I wanted to go back and learning the stuff which turned me on and make learning pleasurable in a way.
Yeah.
And I find that's what I'm finding with my students, that I'm trying to find ways that how can you make learning pleasurable for young people?
Yeah.
While at the same time not generalizing, because we're going back to this generation disconnects of Gen Zs. I mean, I think one thing that maybe you said that it's like you're born with something that you want to learn. Sometimes I'm a bit hesitant about this. I mean, Alex said before that his parents didn't allow you to look at digital devices till the age of whatever it is.
Yeah, they were really skeptical of me using the internet, and people were also a bit more scared of it in the early 2000s. A lot of kind of like, what goes on the internet, but
porn basically.
Porn.
Yeah.
That was actually a big driver for the development
I'm sure
of the
it was.
internet.
Yeah.
Like it's a crazy driver, but. Allow me to generalize about my generation just a little bit. Like, I had a conversation with your younger brother at the Kishot event. I distinctly remember him having a eureka moment when I went up to him and I said, because he was complaining about how disengaged his class was and how, like...
I believe illiterate is the word he used.
Illiterate, yeah, obviously he used a slightly strong language. But I went up to him and I said, a lot of my generation feel insecure about a cornucopia of different things. So they'll feel insecure about how they look as opposed to other people, how they dress as opposed to other people, how strong they are, their physique, anything. But I was like, the one thing that we're not, like the one positive insecurity that we should promote, this was just me rambling a little bit, is intellectual insecurity. So if somebody feels insecure about their intellect, if you're not born with this natural curiosity, you target their ego. You say, you're not as, let's say, smart as I am. It may drive it. For example, with me, when I was a bit young, I was a bit of a smart ass and I stopped reading. I remember, and it was only that switched me on, because when you're young, you tend to have a bit of an inflated ego. Here's me, here's the rest of the world kind of thing, But
some people get stuck there, but okay.
a lot of people get stuck there, but I see a lot of that in my generation for some reason. There were reasons that got me to snap out of it, and I was just like, well, I'm not the only person in the world. Other people are as equally complex as I am, and that kind of switched it on in me. But some people, that's the only way you drive them to go and read something. You tell them, how do you not know about this? Have you never heard of this band? Have you never heard of this idea? And they go, and maybe it switches it on in them.
I just have to comment on that, because what you're describing, that insecurity, is this research that I was referring to is not like some people are born with the gene to constantly learn, but they are born with the, I would say, safety and not going into. I mean, they're not afraid of going into harm. They take risks. So either you are like a early adopter kind of thing, according to that theory, or you're a harm avoider. And if you're a harm avoider, you tend to not go into anything that makes you insecure. You feel like not safe. And because the last driving force that I didn't mention a minute ago is psychological safety. That is maybe the main one for being able to learn lifelong. That you don't feel stupid, that you can ask the questions, that you really can go into those. And that is also something that school is interfering with. Because they ask you to recall your knowledge, they ask you to write tests, but in an unsafe environment.
You learn nothing.
No.
You learn nothing. I think this thing about the risk-taking is so fundamental to this whole thing, okay? We have systems here in this country which are prescriptive, one size fits all.
Yeah.
There have been different regimes trying to rework this. So we do talk about multidisciplinary education. Good luck with that. We do talk about digital and media literacies, information literacies. Good luck with that, because I know that with the kind of work we're doing with the 3CL, by the time I face my students aged 18 and I start talking about critical thinking, untruths, lies, systems of power, most people are blanking me and saying, what the hell is this guy on about? It's too late. The damage has already been done. Now, one of the things that Alex probably benefited from, and maybe my son benefited from, was that I think, I think as soon as my son could sit, he was sitting on his mother's lap and there was a book in front of him, even though it had butterflies on it. And we're losing a lot of that. And I'm part of, I teach new media. So I know that these guys, as soon as they opened their eyes, the so-called digital natives, there was somebody taking a picture of them and then screens stuck in front of them. And it's got to that stage now that the pendulum has swung so far. And we're now talking about AI, as we were starting to think about, to talk about this morning, that we're in this kind of really strange world right now where universities are trying to figure out what is it that we're doing. You could see that most universities' reactions to ChatGPT was, they're going to cheat again. What are we getting? It was the same kind of hysteria which universities had when COVID hit, with colleagues. There were colleagues even at this university saying, I can't do Zoom because my students will laugh at me. To which my reaction was, they're already laughing at you. So what, they're going to laugh in public now? In the same way that we had systems in place here at the university saying, if I'm teaching you via Zoom, for instance, I need you to look at you. I need to be able to see you. And I was one of those guys saying, no, we can't demand that from people because they're sharing their bedrooms. You can see people's socials. Okay, these are all things that we had never even thought about. This can of worms that we've opened up now, and don't know how to deal with. And I believe that we've now come to this kind of stage in our lives that we're risking losing those fundamental literacies, being able to read, being able to write, being able to communicate, and unless you have those, you can't get to thinking. Yet at the same time now, we have the new technologies, the so-called AI, where there's almost like new waves of people saying, I don't need to think anymore because the machine is going to do the thinking for me. In the same way you sent me a link last night, and you said, here it is, what was it? I mean...
It was a TV station called Channel 1, which is totally driven by AI. The hosts are generated by AI. The content is AI curated, but they say that it is, this is what I find interesting coming from the media industry. They say that it is based on fact-checked real stories. From whom? So before this AI generation, there has to be another step. They're still relying on
human input.
Yeah, on the humans and
Are ads run on the Channel 1?
I haven't seen that. I have just seen like a trailer for it where they explain how they do it and that they will. And I mean, they can get very adequate content fast as hell. Just put it in and put some voiceover to it and present it. And it can be personalized, which is interesting because then we get these filter bubbles. So you can choose your news. You don't have to get this public service kind of thinking. But there are other advantages. And I think this discussion is interesting because I actually listened to a 2-hour-long podcast about Aristotle, who formed so much of our view on knowledge, which is the view that if you can't write or debate or put out your opinion in words, then you don't have the knowledge. But maybe in this time where we live, this era, can also help us to see other forms of competences that we do have. Maybe. The best way to look upon it, maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting times, but the thing is, there's nobody who can tell you where this thing is going to pivot right now. So, and because I think some of us are obsessed with this idea of connected learning, that and even if the idea of getting two people in the same room, even if they violently disagree with each other, you can learn something, I think is so important. And I think if we were to take this back to this whole lifelong learning thing, who does it? When do we do it? Where do we do it? At which state are you meant to start? Is all education lifelong learning? Because as far as I'm concerned, it is. But if you consider all education lifelong learning, that's learning for life, do we have the right kind of education systems, even from aged 5? Because I understand, at least in some Nordic countries, kids are being encouraged to question what they see on a screen. Here we have a system where you go to a classroom, whatever you're seeing on the screen, you go to the classroom and whoever is instructing you is giving you knowledge, giving you facts. They're going to examine you via an exam. We'll regurgitate whatever was told to you and you'll forget it within the next 5 minutes. And that's why this morning some of you might have seen me getting a bit upset with my students when I told them, I haven't seen you for 4 weeks. I shared with you a whole series of podcasts, videos, blogs, and you didn't look at it because you didn't think it was going to be examined.
No. But they are trained that way, as I
And
said
they're
to you.
trained that
Yeah.
way. So how can we get around being people trained that way?
Mm.
And here I am sitting, within an institution where I'm teaching study units with ECTS systems, okay? And how do you get around that?
My former manager, who I think you met, Lars, he also been working in the formal school system. He said that the school is like the most change-resistant organization that we actually have. So, as I said to you students, my dark days, I am like feeling some kind of hopeless, a hopeless mindset towards this. Because if we can't change the school system, the educational system, and it's not only about the educational system, it's like everything. Yes, we teach our kids to be very critical. My middle daughter today in the 9th grade, she has a national English test. She called me this morning feeling sick, but she's so nervous, yeah. So, and even in that English national test, there are questions about sources. How do you know it's true? So we tried that, but we left them alone on TikTok. So it's theoretical. It's like in the school, in the educational part of the system, of the learning system. But we left them on TikTok or Snapchat or whatever. We don't talk about how do you recognize if this is a false meme or anything like that. Because that is some kind of, it's another part of this learning, which we don't do in the formal one. So I think we have to have, I'm usually speaking about a new ecosystem. We have to go together, work together in different kind of contexts. And yes, we do have to redesign the whole educational system. I don't know how, because nobody does, because we're living in this shift. We don't even know where to go. So for me, it has become a passion to just focus on the process of learning, because that will not change. We will have to learn together with AI, towards AI, by AI, but we have to learn. So that process to kind of empower people by that process. And you asked, and I dropped the question about Trainstation, because that is a project that I've been doing that has that aim. So it started as a conversation on a party. It was a crazy IT entrepreneur that had this idea. Could we hack the school system, but beside the school system? Could we help people and kids, young people, to learn in other ways? So we raised money. I wrote applications for the innovation agencies in Sweden and so on. And we started, it's kind of a concept and a movement, but it's also like physical locations where kids from mostly outcast areas who has no hope, that area, the kids come quite hopeless. The only thing they hear about is how they will become criminals. They see their elder brothers and sisters already there. And we equip these locations with a super high-tech level of different kind of things to make them like active producers of their life. And I've been walking away in the evenings. People have been saying, how do you dare to go there in the evenings? It's super dangerous. I've been walking away crying from what I've been seeing, from what happens there. It's a safe place. They have like mentors and tutors helping these kids to self-learn, to grasp the knowledge. And they promise every visitor that comes there. It's like about psychological deep understanding of what they need. They promise everyone that within 1 hour you will have made something that you will be proud of. But that will be very on a shallow level. You will want to learn more and deepen it, but you will succeed. You're safe. You can do it. You want to, you have the courage to, we will help you. We will even create some grit for you if needed. But you can do this. And that is a huge difference. I interviewed these kids and they are, of course, naturally comparing to school. And they said, this is the only place where I learn where cooperation is not called cheating, for one example.
And yet, we mentioned this to my dean now before we came in, and Noelie said, you can do that in a small group and one-to-one. Because she was about to go and teach 120 people in some first-year psychology thing, and she said, she's struggling like I do. You know, how do you get something across to 120 people at the same time? That's broadcast. Yeah. It's not learning. Yeah. In the same way that I know if I'm teaching 60 people, as I said, I think you will be changing 5 people's lives. 10 other people will be listening and the others aren't. And I was interested in what you said about active listening and non-active listening. And maybe you should describe that a bit, because I found that very useful.
Yeah, so I was talking about different kind of levels of listening, which is also a crucial skill to have if you're going to be in a context where the aim is for people to learn. So you can listen like on the basic level, which is basically, I hear that you are talking, I'm not interested, but I'm showing you that I'm hearing you. So in the right places, I try to stick in some word or something like that. And then you could listen, which I think is the most common level, where you listen to something and you immediately connect it to your own map. So, oh, it's the same for me. And when I was doing this. And so what you were saying, stuck in your own universe, you're not really interested. And this is what I did find out about journalists. That was actually very many of them were stuck in that center. I'm not really interested in my audience. I just want to teach them or preach to them. And then you have this level called global listening, where you are really engaged and interested, and the follow-up questions comes naturally and so on. And then that I think you were really interested in, like, what is not said? What do I see? How do I interpret this situation? What did you not say that was really the main part of what the information was about, and so on. So, and I think coming back to that Trainstation thing, the knowledge that these kids get, they get it from, they curate lots of material on YouTube. They actually banned TikTok now because it was so distracting. But in other ways, they help them to find this information. They create materials that are made for you to understand and succeed, not for failing, as so many tests in school. But then they listen. They listen to each and every one that comes there, and they don't have to be this broadcaster, because the knowledge they can find themselves, and also by AI, driven by AI even more. But they listen to them, and they hear their needs, and they try to help them out of that.
I'm actually thinking of getting my students to, and especially after today, is that they have to stand up and teach something for 5 minutes to someone. Whether they like it or not. Yeah. Everybody has something that they can teach.
That's the recalling part that I was talking about. You really learn by that. Yeah,
and I think I might even plonk that as part of that, because they will only take something seriously if it's marked, which I find sad, but I also understand it. If you're going through a system which rewards you on the basis of how many study units you've accumulated, how many ECTSs, I don't blame them. And in the same way that they're meeting people like me and telling them that what I'm telling them is important, they're meeting 7 other people. So the cramming is another thing that we have to look at that. Is there anything else we need to talk about in terms of?
No, but I was curious. We were talking about redesigning the whole education.
Yeah, I don't know how to
what would you like?
What do you want? I mean, you've decided it's no good for you, and you're going to go and do your military training, whatever you're going to be doing.
Yeah. Although I'd like to hear Ian's opinion first, because I'm a bit of a primitivist when it comes to reforming the education system.
Yeah.
I think Ian's more progressive than I am.
The fastest way to do it is definitely by doing it laterally, so pushing, as Trainstation is doing, pushing for change inside while seeing that what can't happen now, you do on your own, or aside from.
So learning on your own is just as important as learning within the system, right?
I mean, like setting up
a context beside the formal system, just to trying to innovate. Yeah.
And yet I failed through the 4 weeks that I had away, and gave my students all sorts of stuff that I wanted them to look at.
But you're in the system.
On their own,
you're still within the system. Yeah. So what we did at Trainstation is beside. Yeah. But do you see any other initiatives that you get hopeful from in that way?
I see a lot of online learning being that, so stuff like what the Arizona State University is doing.
Yeah.
With setting up online programs where you can attend an online version of their classes where you're still getting mentorship, and you're not paying you pay, considering it's a university class, you're not paying much to attend a class, and then you do take the exam, whatever, till the end. And you only pay the full price when you want the qualification.
Yeah, exactly.
I think programs like that maybe can reach a wider audience, can reach the working audience, are very useful.
Okay, so if you're not as progressive, what do you want to see?
So for me, there's a conceptual misunderstanding in the basic ontological process of what happens within education. Like, my mum has this weird anecdotal story about how when she was growing up in the Soviet Union, she didn't like watching the TV because she felt like her grandmother, who was in one of these Stalinist labor camps, would always tell her that it is, how do I translate it, like a prescriptive form of media.
Yeah.
And if you read, you are taking syntax and turning it into semantics in your head. Same way as when you write, you're taking semantics in your head and turning it into syntax. Anything that you watch or listen to, listening is kind of a middle ground because you're still creating the imagery in your head.
Yeah.
But this idea of creating what philosophers call qualia in your head, like creating images out of qualia, out of pure sensation, it's the most important process, and that's what kind of makes me identify as an educational primitivist, which is basically you have to go to the drawing board. You can't. It's like what Jacob has been doing at Oxford.
The Oxbridge model of
Exactly. You have to read and you have to write and you have to defend what your opinions about what you have read, and you have to do it. I'm such a primitivist that I say you have to physically learn how to write. That there is something behind it. Because if you don't, it's people come to me and they say, how are we going to fix the scheme of assessment because AI is basically destroying educational institutions, it's destroying their credibility. I'm like, you go back to the standard model. You force everyone to read, you force them to write physical essays. None of the computers. Computers and laptops and phones should be banned in the classroom, and it should be a fully engaging debate. Nothing should be taken away from it. It should be 100% immersive. Because education is something human, maybe I'm a bit like anti-rationalization.
No, I don't think so. I think we're just at a pivotal moment.
I think
That's all. And I think it's kind of fragmenting between either some people attributing it to generational divides, which is the simplest and probably most stupid way of looking at it, but I can't get away from the fact that you guys have had technology from the moment that you were born, as opposed to my generation. I remember pre-internet, post-internet, and that's really important. My idea of a social network is not an online social network. It was going out to hang out with people and get drunk with people. You guys now, as my son keeps on telling me, not only he doesn't particularly like drinking, but he said if I had to go out and get drunk, somebody's going to film me on a mobile phone, potentially. And that is also going to be something which is challenging from his perspective.
But that's because the digital and the real world now overlap.
Yeah.
Completely.
Like,
They're the
It's
same.
just the world now.
It's the world. It is the world. In the same way that your generation is going to be one of the last that remembers pre-AI and post-AI. When we're talking about, we're having a podcast here as four real human beings, I think, looking at each other. Very soon, I mean, Katarina could have stayed in Gothenburg and recorded her voice. And I could have stayed in Siju, and you guys have got whatever. And probably we could have, even AI could have got this kind of conversation if we fed into it some of the questions that we thought we were going to be answering. We haven't used them, by the way, most of them.
we have.
And had an AI type of conversation the same way that Katarina is saying. There's an AI news channel. Now, I still think, totally agree with you. We have to get back to the basics. Now, I know that the only way I can teach is through stories. And I know that's the only way I can have impact on people's lives. Is stories. I don't believe in this regurgitation of facts. Let's know what is a fact now. Okay, Trump will, it's not just a fake news kind of thing. We're into this new era now that even if you lie 15 times, somebody will believe it. Let alone that now AI is going to help propagate the lie. So we're living in very strange times, I think. I think going back to some basics, which I think we're going to lose some of them, and I think it's going to go back to, ironically, decent parenting, which is really unsexy. Okay, I had a conversation with a former education minister, quite a violent one, about 3 weeks ago, because I said it's the failure of the education system, and he told me no, it's the failure of the family system.
But that's a slippery slope, because then you can start blaming it on macro sociological processes and
For sure.
Yes. So we can't go into the blame game.
No,
We can't go. It's too late beyond the blame game. Now it's a question of what do we do with the state of things as they are. They're going to be messy. I will stick to my thought that I really believe in this idea of connected learning. Katarina knows something. I learned from what Katarina said today. I learned from somewhat of what you guys said today. But I also learn from YouTube. I learn from podcasts. I learn more from podcasts than I do from academic book. Okay, I read a lot of this junk, and now I skim read and say, oh yeah, I get that. But sometimes I hear conversation between two people from different camps and trying to address the same problem, and I learn from that. And I think academic institutions have to recognize the fact that we should try and get people to learn using the new media that we have, that we can learn from other people.
It's not either way. It's both,
It's
for
both,
me.
yeah.
It's like, yes, I actually agree with you. Some things are, and also when I'm studying with my kids, I can see when they actually need a book because they want to go back and forth, they want to hold something tangible, they want to do things. But I can also see that the book is outdated like in 5 minutes in other cases. I can see that they have to learn to think fast because the world is fast, but I also am sure that they need to learn how to think slow. And so there are different things, and it's like I made a really interesting interview not long ago on the podcast with a professor in church history, which actually also made me learn about that the church grew like not an institution, but like this loose network. It's a network and going together and filling people's needs and so on. And now in Sweden, which is very non-religious, we don't have any like center of that kind. So we go to the, I don't know, music industry to try to find those campfires that we talked about earlier and so on. And he also told me that every time that this kind of institution started to grow, we had this format revolution, as we do now. But this format AI is changing so much that we don't even see it as a format anymore. But it doesn't mean that we will be able to live without it. It's here. It's here to stay. So we cannot only have the cheating discussion. We have to have the discussion, how do you learn together with it? And me, for an example, when the OpenAI services was down one day, I was like, where is my assistant, library, the text communicator? Where is the things that I'm working with together with to learn? So I think we have to have those kind of discussions as well. How to help kids, especially kids, to cope this reality.
And yet I first heard about ChatGPT in Sweden, in the place, I was this lifelong learning forum in a place I can't even pronounce. I don't even remember what
Stenungsbaden. Yes.
This place we were in. Okay, and I don't know what I was talking about, but I remember it was all in Swedish, which is why, and I was the only guy doing stuff in English, so you can imagine. But at some stage, somebody dragged me and said, you need to speak to this guy.
Yeah.
And I went to speak to this guy called Erik.
Yes.
And Erik, I was told, was doing something which I might be interested in. And it turned out he was finishing a PhD. He was in theology and AI or something like that. And he told me this thing called ChatGPT. And I said, this was what, a year and a half ago?
Yeah.
I can't remember. Okay. And my question was, what is ChatGPT? And he said, this is going to, I think he didn't use the word destroy everything that you know about education, but he said he's going to have to rethink education from the ground.
Yeah, and he's a teacher from the
And he's a teacher. He's a teacher. So again, one of my final questions is this, okay? You asked me, who are you, okay? So my question is, why the hell did you come to Malta when I invited you?
Because you invited me. No, but for sure because of this, if somebody opens the door and say, hey, can we learn together? Because that is also something that we have discovered, speaking of research about learning, that you always learn better together with others. So if somebody opens the door and say, hey, come and learn together with us, it takes very much for me to say no. I mean, I'm that curious and wants to do something. And then also, I'm really struggling in my everyday life in the structures that we have, in the institutions that we have, that I can see do not serve the needs of people and countries and societies today. So if anything gives me hope that we could start to even have a discussion on what to do with that, I'm always open to that. So that's why I came.
I think we're obsessed at the moment at the 3CL also with the concept of young people and information. And what is information? So we've had conferences about this. We've published something called the manifesto. And the first thing, again, I've tried to test this out with some people in my class. And some of the reactions were very interesting. Some people got it. Some people said, there are too many words. What is a manifesto? The design of it is aesthetically repulsive to me. So, and it got me into this kind of new language. But then again, this is no different to people sending me WhatsApps with emojis and me saying, "What is that? A clapping cowboy? What does it mean?" Okay, so we're all trying to find a way of bridging. I think this generation divide. In the same way that I could never understand my father. Maybe I still don't, but in the same way that I have a son who's academic, whom these guys know, and they were talking about this old way of learning, which was the Oxford way of tutorials. Universities can't afford that. but it's the most beautiful way of learning, that you're forced to write something
And defend.
and
Yeah.
defend it.
Yeah.
Now, since when did we ask young people, A, to have an opinion, defend it, even give them the time to listen to them, let alone write it down? That doesn't happen, not in the education
To be
system
honest,
we have.
it does with online content creation, no?
Yeah, young people are very opinionated.
Yeah.
And so these are the kind of things that I think it's what makes me get out of bed in the morning, whether I'm coming here, and it's a very different experience for me teaching at university, because ironically, it's almost out of my comfort zone. And we were discussing this with the dean as well today. My tribe is not necessarily at university or universities, but my tribe might be in different universities. The challenge is finding those people.
Yeah.
And finding people who, and I think the only common DNA that I'm trying to find at the moment are people who are addicted to learning. In other words, the waking up in the morning and say, why did that happen? And who did that? And then as you get older like I am, what can I do about it with the time that I have left? And I think that's, if I had to leave this idea of lifelong learning, and whether my generation was lucky or not that we didn't have really a university to go to, because we went into this overnight from a tertiary education to, it was almost kind of a worker system that you had to get a sponsor to be able to get to university. I think it was a system. It was made with all the best intentions in the world, horribly executed. And yet I still think that I got something out of it. And like you, I think when I get my students say, who's working? And I see the hands left, and there's part of me saying, you're supposed to be here as students. You've got plenty of time to go into the labor market and the capitalist system and the rest of it, but it's simply not going to happen. But I think we have to find some way of bridging like-minded people wherever they happen to be, despite the jobs that they've been forced to be in, and the restrictions of whether working 9 to 5, or in our case at the 3CL, we're working with whatever time people have, I think, to try and get something done. And that's what I'm obsessed with. And then I think going back and turning back with this idea of, can podcasts change lives? Can podcasts educate? I think it's, for me, I'm learning mostly through that medium at the moment. And I'm not listening to them necessarily when I'm driving, but we also multitask these days. And just because people multitask doesn't mean that they're necessarily distracted, but they may get easily bored like I do. I always have about 10 different tabs open on my screen, because I come from Chris sending me a WhatsApp to me working on a piece of
10, I have a 35 or
there,
something.
okay.
My computer is crashing.
And maybe we have to recognize that this is also a form of learning.
Yeah, it is.
And it doesn't, and so trying to bridge between that, what the academy was supposed to be about, and then what we haven't spoken about and probably have no time to speak about today, which is what the labor market is expecting. And the gaps that there are between people coming out of here with a funny hat and being told you now have a master's or you have credentials, and then people saying, what do I do with this guy or this girl who either thinks that they've learned it all, or in reality they want to be an influencer and want to make money and as being self-employed. Okay, these gaps I think are, I think it's our job to at least recognize them and then see whatever works. Because if a YouTube clip is the way you're going to learn, then let's encourage people to learn of YouTube clips. What we do with the labor market, whatever that means, I think it's something we'll have to discuss.
Separate episode.
It's a separate episode.
We're on an hour and 5 minutes, so I think it would be pretty cool to get a closing statement from each and every one of you, and just kind of like.
So, what your closing statement, Katarina? Yes,
like a super podcaster next.
Yeah, no, he could make in another life he would make a serial podcaster.
Yeah. So I think my unit at RISE is called Lifelong Learning, so that's obliging. I always seek people, like you said, to do this together with. But my department that my unit belongs to is called, it's a super cool name, I think, Prototyping Societies. So that is the department name, and that is what I'm trying to do every day. That is also the answer why you asked me why I came here, why I'm in the research projects I'm in, why I'm doing this podcast. Whatever I'm doing is trying myself my way ahead. And I think that's the only thing we can do at this point, since we are in this heavy shift of paradigms of learning, of planet of everything. So I think we should continue prototyping the society that we want, and not only going into despair that AI will create it for us. That's me.
That's brilliant. Boss.
Well, I thought you were going to say something.
No, he's last because he
I'm
asked.
going last because I
Yeah.
Oh, you have some lasting statement. I don't have any lasting statement. I'm obsessed with learning. I told you guys. I think if I stop learning, I die. And I think my model is, again, and I keep on repeating, is my 94-year-old father-in-law whose body is disintegrating on a daily basis. And you will look at him and you think here's an old man, then he doesn't have much time to live. He's lost all his siblings, his wife, 2 of his children. He's the last one standing. And the only thing keeping him alive, I think, are 2 things. One is his daughter on WhatsApp every day, calling him using technology. And the other thing is his mobility scooter, which is in very sexy red and with Bluetooth speakers.
Lost, yeah.
And he tells me that when I
So
told
cool.
him, why did you get Bluetooth speakers? He said, it's very useful if you're going down Alton High Street and you can see this old lady coming through you, and she's about to come and say, and he said, I really don't want to talk to her. And then I put the music on
Turn
and I
up.
say, see you next time. And he crosses to the other side of the road. So I think a lot of the presumptions we have about generation divides, and that's the frustration I have when I'm teaching what I'm teaching. I get people telling me, sometimes I get people saying, move on. We know this. All of these things which upset you, deep fakes, lies, Trump getting re-elected, on all of this. We know this. There's no free lunch. We know this. Okay. I think that's the only thing I know, that if the day I stop learning means that is the day that, I'm ready to be tubed off, I think, and I can go to whatever awaits me on the other side. Yeah, so you can have your 5 seconds.
I just used Katrina's like highest level of listening, and I understood what you said that wasn't being said, and I understood that you want us to keep your brain in a vat after you die, so we can preserve it. Okay, Ian, over to you.
If you want to talk about whether podcasts change people's lives, I think you can ask any average Andrew Tate listener about that, and he changed their lives for sure.
It's an influential medium.
Yeah. So influence, power, podcasts, learning, lifelong learning, everything is entangled together. It's our job, those of us who are whether it's in education or lifelong learning, and I think they're the same thing. Okay, and those of us who are trying to get something done, influence people, annoy the EU policymakers, I think you just have to keep pushing, I think. Anyway, thank
Just
you.
another form of influencer.
That's it.
So, Alex.
You've been listening to the 3CL podcast, and fear nothing except for your epistemic blind spots.